everybody's phones off.
Okay, oh, Sarah, am I out of the picture?
Yes,
Turn it more.
we're live.
We're live.
We're live. We're live.
It's Tuesday night. Well, welcome everybody to our whirlwind tour through the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is the apocalypse of Jesus Christ, and of course, apocalypse means the unveiling, the revelation, pulling back the curtain to reveal what's behind it. And last week we did the fifth seal. And remember that was the souls of those who've been slain because of the word of God and the testimony they've maintained. And the visual device that's used here, sort of the word picture, is that of the souls under the altar of sacrifice. Just as the blood of sacrifice was splashed against the altar or poured out at the base of the altar, the blood would be hidden and covered underneath the altar of sacrifice. And so we talked about that as a paradigm for martyrdom and those righteous souls and that righteous blood that would be shed, the most righteous and most innocent blood, that being of the Savior. But that it was the blood of martyrs, it was the blood of animals that were sacrificed in the temple worship, eventually leading up to Christ, and then those martyrs that follow. Because remember, in the Revelation later, we'll see that those martyrs become those who have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Whereas before that part of Revelation that I think is the event of the incarnation of Christ, it is those whose testimony and who are aware of He who sits on the throne, they're aware of the Lamb, but not the Messiah by name. And so there's a transition point at which then the testimony becomes that of Jesus Christ, not of the Lamb and not of He who sits on the throne. And so in this course, we've begun to understand that there are certain time stamps, perhaps, if that's what they represent, that indicate that this is a linear story in time. And that it follows a pattern of the literary device that's used, which is the scroll. And I go over this at the beginning of every class, so if you've heard this before, you have. The scroll written front and back, which is the plan of the revelation, the apocalypse. It is the plan of the unveiling of God's Messiah. It's the unveiling of God's Christ, and who is worthy? No one but the Lamb who gives itself in sacrifice is made worthy. And so before this plan of God's Christ can be revealed, first 7 seals must be removed. There are obstacles that prevent announcing the opening of the scroll. And then once the seals, all the impediments to opening the scroll are removed, there are 7 trumpets that announce the scroll is going to be opened. The mystery of God's Christ is about to be revealed. The mystery of God is about to be revealed with the 7th trumpet. And we'll see that those events describe very beautifully actual literal events in the heavens that coincided with what is likely the date of either the conception or the birth of Jesus. Now, remember the 5th seal couldn't be limited to any type of discrete event. It just talks about this cumulative number of souls under the altar and how that the guilt of that innocent blood would be cumulative throughout the history of man. And so we see that the souls under the altar as of that time, there's a cumulative guilt. When we get to Jesus and his words to the Pharisees and the scribes, he said, you build the tombs of the prophets and you decorate the graves of the righteous, but in that you testify that you are the children of those that slew them. Go ahead and finish their work. Speaking of his own, the fact that they would take his life, then you remember that he placed upon them the guilt of all the righteous martyrs from A to Z, from Abel, whose blood cried from the ground for justice, to the righteous Zechariah, son of Berechiah, who was slain between the temple and the altar of sacrifice around the time just before the Babylonian captivity. And in that A to Z in our alphabet, it was also from the first part of the Jewish Bible, Genesis, to the last book of the Jewish Bible, the Second Chronicles. So he's saying that you're now guilty of all of those up to this point, and you'll complete that guilt with me. And then we see that by the end of the Revelation, covering that period of time from Christ to the new heaven and the new earth, we see that the mystery Babylon, the whore that rides the beast, which it's inescapable that the description there, if we go back to the prophetic voices of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Amos, and Hosea, etc., that's speaking of Jerusalem. And so he makes mystery Babylon guilty of all the blood shed on the earth in judgment. And so the punctuations of judgment that you'll see, like the great flood of Noah, was a judgment on the earth. It was a cleansing of the earth. The judgment of Israel with the Babylonian captivity, the judgment of Israel with the fall of Jerusalem and the desolation of the land of Israel between 70 AD and 135 AD, and yet a yet to come third destruction that will be final. That none of those things, none of those judgments, well, first of all of those judgments are meant to bring men to repentance. It's meant to bring the people of God, Israel, back to God. And failing that, failing repentance, there is no forgiveness or justification that absolves of the guilt of that innocent blood. And so with each period of judgment that's meant to bring to repentance, if repentance does not follow, then the guilt of innocent blood goes back all the way to the beginning. And that's a very tragic and intimidating thing to consider. But that's the story that's being laid out here. So that judgment cannot absolve one of guilt. Just because you are judged for your sin does not mean you are forgiven of your sin. Righteous judgment and chastisement is evidence of the love of God. And David, the love of God, a man after his own heart, when his sin was revealed, he came to repentance, but yet he was judged. Saul, his predecessor, was meted out judgment, but he never repented. And so there's that tragedy that even though men feel the consequences of the judgment of God, men after God's own heart repent. Others do not. Some will repent, some will not. And so this is the recurring story in the revelation of Jesus Christ. It's the recurring story of this final book in our Bible. And so these initial pages set down that paradigm that speaks to a pattern that will be repeated with each judgment. The only difference being that the cumulative guilt of those who are unrepentant only increases. The judgment does not reduce their guilt. The only way to assuage guilt is through the sacrifice of the righteous Savior and looking to the blood of Jesus Christ. And so the judgments fall on those who reject Jesus Christ, which is the only remedy for sin. Even judgment does not erase sin. Only repentance. So, let's go to the apocalypse. And last week we did that fifth seal, and tonight we'll do the sixth seal, number 12. Now, this class is a bit different than the others. I will not be appealing tonight to many verses in the prophetic words of the Old Testament, because this is something that is not spoken of in these terms very explicitly. And we all know the story, and one of the reasons I'm going to do it the way I'm going to do it tonight is I'm going to introduce a novel concept. This is not a concept that I have been exposed to through commentary or courses or teaching anything. I've never heard this from the pulpit. But in keeping with our linear story, punctuated by events on which we can place a timestamp, I think it's very reasonable to place a timestamp here with the sixth seal. And in fact, this is probably the only timestamp among the seven seals. Of the seven seals, the sixth one is the only one that I think will provide us a context for the time at which these events are taking place and this paradigm is being set. And the sixth seal does lend itself to that interpretation because it seems to speak more of a discrete time, a set of events that are closely related temporally, and that all speak to one central theme, one central larger event, that they're pieces and parts of something larger, because they're all, it's a number of features that are just packed in together without any intervening information. And so it seems to be common to one larger event that has a number of features. Now, tonight's class is made a little bit difficult in that it is novel. The idea that this could be speaking to a single event is not too novel, but some people will put that event off into the future. Some people will spiritualize it and break it up and describe other events for which it might be applicable. But in my keeping, in my understanding of the sequence of the seals, trumpets, and then bowls of wrath, is that the events of the seals represent, the four horsemen represent the paradigm of divine judgment. The fifth seal represents the nature of the shedding of innocent blood on the earth, whether that's blood of martyrs or innocent blood of the blood of innocent bulls and goats, or ultimately the most innocent of all blood, Jesus Christ. So this paradigm is being set up, this paradigm of judgment with our famous triad, the sword, famine, and plague, right? Just repeated over and over again in the prophetic words. So this paradigm is being set up. And so what we see is the nature of judgment, the cumulative guilt that results in judgment, the shedding of innocent blood. And now with the sixth seal, I think what we see is an act of actual judgment. Now there were a number of acts of judgment in the first half of the book of Genesis. The initial act of judgment was what? The expulsion of man from the garden was an act of judgment. There were other more minor ones, but if you consider the opening parts of Genesis, what was the most prominent act of judgment in the early parts of the Genesis?
Are you referencing Cain and Abel, or are you referencing something different?
A little further on. Maybe. Let's get to the 6th chapter of Genesis, where we see a really major act of judgment, right? The world is destroyed by a flood. And so I'd like to propose, anyway, that the 6th seal is representative of the events of the flood of Noah. Now, everybody knows the story of Noah's ark and the flood of Noah, but think about the perspective from which we know that story. we only really know that story from the perspective of the people in the boat. And, you know, that's a fairly limited perspective. There could have been a lot of stuff going on around them that they would have been completely aware of that could be revealed supernaturally to John, that the bearers of the story of Noah and his family, would have just been completely unaware of because they were confined inside the ark. In fact, what little they knew about the outside world was by the release of birds and what they brought back and how long it took them to come back. You know, they didn't have a direct perspective on all the things that were going on. And so before we get too far in this, I'm going to read this 12th through 17th verses. And then I'm going to show you a YouTube video that speaks to the events of Noah's flood from a perspective that you may not have seen it. Now, for the benefit of people for whom we'll just have the link and not my comments during the video, I don't agree with everything that's said in the video. Some of the geology and science I don't have any direct knowledge of. I understand many of the words. I'm not an expert in these areas, and so I wouldn't know about necessarily the veracity of it. It does come from a reliable source as far as Christian faith interacting with science, but it's clearly outside any field that I've studied. So, but it is a very interesting thing, and it tends to unify a lot of questions. But what it does, more than unify some questions, is it raises many more. And so and many of them are raised because we know very little of the story that begins in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Genesis 6, 1 through 4 is especially mysterious. And there are all kinds of commentary and that sort of thing, but just as of a few years ago, all of the commentaries on the subject of Genesis 6, 1 through 4 became obsolete with the uncovering of some archaeological findings and some scholarly study of translations of some ancient manuscripts that have only recently been found. And our understanding of the backstory behind Genesis 1 through 4 changed completely. So you're not going to go to Matthew Henry or Barclay's commentaries or anything and find any of this because this information was not available largely when they wrote their commentaries, and it's something that's only now emerging. And I think it's because that we are in fact in the last days that this information is just currently coming to light. But we will spend probably several weeks studying the story that is in our Old Testament only represented by those first 4 verses of the 6th chapter of Genesis. And it said, and we'll go to that and read it at the appropriate time. I just want to tell you that this story about the events and the state of the world that leads up to the judgment represented by Noah, the flood of Noah, there's far more to that period of time than you might imagine. And that one little cryptic remark in the 6th chapter of Genesis that says that the sons of God saw the daughters of men, that they were fair, they took wives of them whom they chose. And it just mentions very abruptly that, and there were giants in the land. And so we know there's a story there. And many of our hypotheses have centered around one or more as near natural explanations for that situation as we could come up with. And the most prominent of that is the Sethian hypothesis, which really doesn't hold water very, in my opinion, but what's come to light more recently is that the ancient literature, including more recently found bodies of things that could be considered scripture, tell a story that gives us a supernatural explanation that these sons of God, these B'nai Ha-Elohim, were angelic beings, and in some of the ancient literature known as the Watchers, and that they were given custody of the earth from a supernatural realm, but began to ill-advisedly and wickedly interact with it. And their motivation was to become creators, like God is a creator. And all they did, rather than create anything, all they did was just mess things up royally. And so we'll see that the story of the entry of evil in the world becomes far more rich and far more full of content than we ever imagined once we get into that. But that's not my intent tonight, because if we can't get past the idea that the words I'm about to read represent the flood of Noah, then there's really no sense going into all that, because that doesn't make any sense. However, if these things that we're about to read actually represent the events of the flood of Noah, and it is the second of our timestamps. Remember, our first timestamp was the lamb slain before the foundation of the world. If this is our second timestamp, and it does represent the flood of Noah, I think it tells us that it gives legitimacy to the timestamps that I think are far more clear as we go forward. So let me read. In Revelation 6 and 12, I watched as he, the Lamb, opened the sixth seal, and there was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" And we'll find that that last sentence is paralleled by the exact same sentence in the prophet Hosea. And it tells about a similar act of judgment that was not Noah's flood. But here we see that it's the beginning of an echo that accompanies divine judgment and that will punctuate the history of the earth from here out. So it says, a great earthquake, sun turned black, moon turned blood red, and the stars of the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. Now, we'll see that often in the Apocalypse, often in this book of Revelation, we'll see that there's clearly symbolic language that's mingled with literal language. And sometimes the language is meant to be both literal and figurative. So here, and this is really very rich with that, because when it says that there was a great earthquake, we'll find out in our study that immediately preceding the flood of Noah, there was not only a literal large earthquake, as we'll see in the video tonight. There was a huge, monstrous and monumental battle that was waged, where the children of the Watchers slew each other while their angelic parents watched on as part of their punishment, just before these angelic beings are doomed to chains of gloomy darkness, like are described in 1 Peter and in Jude. So we'll see that this explanation of things will have ramifications not just for our study of the Revelation here, but it will have an impact on our understanding of many, many other Bible verses in the Gospels and in the words of Jesus, as well as in the epistles and in this book of Revelation. So it's both a literal and a figurative thing. Same thing with the stars falling to earth. Now, we know that stars don't literally fall to the earth. We call things shooting stars and that sort of thing that are meteorites and even asteroids from time to time in the history of the world that have fallen from the sky to the Earth's surface. But generally, in the Revelation, when we begin to see things concerning the stars, we see that the stars represent angelic beings. We see that here. We'll see that in the trumpets when the great star falls from heaven. We'll see it in the 13th chapter of Revelation, where the dragon's tail drags a third of the stars, and right after that, it lets us know in no uncertain terms it's talking about a battle in the heavenly realms where Satan and his angels are cast down, lose their standing in heaven. And so when we see stars mentioned, it's some type of heavenly being. There'll be another occasion where we'll see stars, where it mentions the moon and the sun, and the stars, a third of all were darkened. And I think that's not clearly angelic divine beings. I think it's speaking to the children of Israel. And it comes from the dream that Joseph had, that he related to his father and his brothers, that made them hate him so. That he saw his father as the sun, his mother as the moon, and then his 12 brothers as 12 stars. And they all bowed down to him. And so the moon, the sun, and the stars there may well represent the children of Israel. But it is these set apart and holy things that are represented as stars, whether it be Israel or whether it be the angelic beings who disobeyed. So, then we see, we have other literal language, like we have clearly symbolic language in the same sentence with clearly literal language, and that is that the heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up. I don't know exactly what that's describing, but it doesn't seem literal to me. But then it says every mountain and island was removed from its place. And as we'll see in the video here in just a little bit, that may well be, it almost certainly is literal language. Its symbolic nature, I haven't got a grasp on yet, if it exists. So, all that being said, that equating the flood of Noah with the violence of this sixth seal is something that we're not accustomed to considering. But after we watch the video, those of you at home that are watching will go to the link when this finally gets posted on the website, and at this point watch this 20 or 25 minute video that shows why it's very reasonable perhaps to think that this sixth seal is speaking of the act of judgment represented by Noah's flood. And we will handle questions next week so I can do it on camera. So if we can stop now, we'll watch the video.